developed in her life. At Embley and Leyhurst there were comfort, security, and affection. There were intelligence and companionship, and yet beneath the surface there was no peace. Florence was brought up in a hothouse of emotion, the result of a literary fashion. Romanticism had penetrated English life, and ordinary wives and mothers were reproducing the behavior of the heroines of Byron and Chateaubriand. Women prided themselves on their excessive sensibility, and delicacy was universal. Fanny, Partha, and Florence were all considered delicate, though Fanny lived to be 92, Florence 90, and Partha 75. Miss Nightingale was indelibly impressed by this atmosphere. Though her extraordinary mind owed its quality to uncompromising clarity and realism, her character throughout her life contained the contradiction that she was emotional, prone to exaggeration, and abnormally sensitive. The summer of 1834 brought a turning point for the family. Wen was invited to stand for Parliament as a candidate from Andover. He went into the contest full of enthusiasm and hope, and Fanny saw her plans for Wen's entry into public life maturing. But she was defeated. Wen's seat was lost because he refused to purchase votes. His first contact with the practical politics left him profoundly disillusioned, and he resolved never to enter political life again. He ceased now to adapt himself to the character of a country gentleman Fanny had planned. He gave up hunting, spent more time teaching Florence, and took to passing the greater part of each day in his library. His natural home, he was fond of saying, was in the quiet and the shadows. But such a life was unbearable to Fanny. She transferred her ambitions to her daughters. They were 16 and 17 in 1835. Next year, or the year after, they must be launched in society. But now Embley was discovered to be inadequate for this. 6 more bedrooms must be added, new kitchens built. Fanny proposed that while the alterations were carried out, they should make an extended tour abroad with the girls. Wen agreed. He loved Europe. The alterations to Embley were started at once, and the Nightingales fixed a date to leave. At this moment, in the midst of bustle, plans, discussions, Florence received what she believed to be a call from God. It is possible to know a great deal about Miss Nightingale's inner life because she had the habit of writing what she called private notes. She was unhappy in her environment, she had no one to confide in, and she poured herself out on paper. A very large number of her private notes exist. She wrote them on anything that came to hand. Odd pieces of blotting paper, backs of calendars, margins of letters. Sometimes she dated them, sometimes not. Sometimes they cover several foolscap papers, sometimes consist of one sentence. From time to time she also kept diaries, but it was in her private notes, written from girlhood to old age, that she recorded her true feelings. It was in one of these that she wrote, "On February 7th, 1837, God spoke to me and called me to his service." She heard, as Joan of Arc had, a voice outside of herself, speaking to her in human words. She was not quite 17, and her dream world was often more actual to her than the real world, but the voices which spoke to her were not a phenomenon of adolescence. Nearly 40 years later, she wrote in a private note that her voices had spoken to her 4 times. Once on February 7th, 1837, the date of her call. Once in 1853, before going to her first post at the Hospital for Poor Gentlewomen in Harley Street. Once before the Crimea in 1854, and once before the death in 1861 of Sidney Herbert, her most influential friend and protector. Her path was not made clear. God had called her, but what form that service was to take she did not know. The idea of nursing did not enter her mind. She doctored sick pets. She was especially fond of babies. Her protective instincts were strong, but they had not yet led her to the knowledge that God had called her to the service of the sick. Meanwhile she was at peace, full of confidence and faith. God had spoken to her once. Presently he would speak to her again. On September 8th, 1837, the Nightingales crossed from Southampton to Le Havre. The next day they left Le Havre in brilliant weather in a travelling carriage which Wen had designed. It was enormous, drawn by 6 horses ridden by postilions. On the roof were seats for servants and for the family to admire the scenery. The girls sat on the roof, the postilions sang and cracked their whips, and the carriage lumbered down the straight roads of France. Florence was in transports of delight. She recorded in her diary that at Chartres she sat all night at her window enchanted by the beauty of moonlight on the cathedral. Yet for all her rhapsodies she remained precise. Each day she noted in her diary the exact hours of departure and arrival and the exact distance covered. On December 15th they drove into the gay town of Nice, where there was a large English colony. With a startling suddenness, cathedrals and scenery vanished from Florence's diary and letters. She developed a passion for dancing, and wrote to her favourite cousin and most intimate friend, Hilary Bonham Carter, that at the biggest ball of the season she danced every quadrille. When the time came to leave Nice for Italy, she was heartbroken. Her tears dried themselves with remarkable speed. From the city of Florence, Fanny wrote her sister that the Grand Duke of Tuscany was exceedingly distinguished and polite, the balls at the ducal palace exceedingly fine, and that Flo had been much noticed. The opera in Florence was one of the best in Europe, and Flo, music mad, persuaded Fanny to take her 3 times a week. She did more than go into transports. She kept a book in which she made a detailed comparison of the score, libretto, and performance of every opera she heard. Her mind demanded something hard to bite on, and the romantic extravagance of her emotion crystallized surprisingly into facts and figures. By the following autumn, the Nightingales were back in France. When proposed to spend some months in Paris and took an extremely splendid apartment in the Place Vendôme, with gilt mirrors and velvet draperies in the dining room, crimson satin and ebony cabinets in the salon. Fanny intended, if possible, to enter intellectual society, and had an introduction, of which she had great hopes, to one of the most celebrated women in Paris, Miss Mary Clarke. Without money or beauty, though, with excellent family connections, Mary Clarke had made herself a major figure in the political and literary world of Paris. Every Friday night, cabinet ministers, dukes, bishops, scholars, and writers crowded the drawing room of her apartment at 120 Rue du Bac. Mary Clarke's personal appearance was odd. She was very small, with the figure of a child. Her eyes were startlingly large and bright, and at a period when women brushed their hair smoothly, she wore hers over her forehead in a tangle of curls. Guizot, the French statesman, said that she and his Yorkshire terrier patronized the same coiffeur. Yet though she had no ordinary feminine attractions, men were devoted to her, and many men wished to marry her. The celebrated author Chateaubriand delighted in her. "Boredom is impossible where she is," he declared. She entered distinguished circles partly through her close friendship with Claude Fauriel, the renowned medieval scholar. In 1837, Mary and Fauriel had been on terms of intimacy for more than 15 years. He dined with her almost every night, was invariably present at her parties, and behaved as master of the house, yet Mary's reputation was unblemished. There was in fact no cause for scandal. They were friends, not lovers. Mary loved Fauriel, but he had never asked her to marry him, had offered her only devoted friendship. The Nightingales were not the kind of connection which appealed to Mary Clarke. She did not care for young ladies. She was, however, absurdly fond of children. She acknowledged Fanny's letter of introduction by inviting the Nightingales to a children's soirée. One afternoon near Christmas, they drove up to 120 Rue du Bac, and walked into a drawing-room, crowded with dancing, singing children. In the midst of them, clapping her hands, was a strange little figure who Florence realized must be Mary Clarke. The children began to play blind man's buff, and without ado, Florence picked up her skirts and joined in. It was the happiest possible introduction. She was never so unself-consciously gay as with children. Immediately, Mary Clarke fell in love with the whole family, most of all with Florence, but also with Wen's remote charm, Fanny's rich beauty and kindness, and Partha's elegance. They christened her Clarky, and she turned their stay in Paris into a carnival. She took the girls to parties, to studios, to concerts, to the famous salon of Madame Récamier. They met Chateaubriand, and were paid the great compliment of being invited to hear him read his memoirs. Florence was wildly happy. She had a passion for Clarky. She was beginning an important friendship with Julius Moll, an Oriental scholar of great distinction who was hopelessly in love with Mary Clarke. For the first time in her life, young Florence was breathing the air of freedom. One of the deepest impressions she received was made by Clarky's friendship with Claude Fauriel. She observed that Clarky and Fauriel met daily, that Fauriel had great respect for Clarky's mental powers, and treated her as an equal. Above all, that this close intimacy was accepted by everyone without disapproval. She acquired a belief in the possibility of a close friendship between a man and a woman, on terms which did not include passion, and which did not provoke scandal. It was a belief she never lost, and one which was to regulate her conduct throughout her life. In April, the family left Paris, as Fanny wished to spend the season in London and have the girls presented at court. Fanny was well satisfied. The tour had shown her that in Florence she possessed a daughter who promised to be exceptional. Florence's success in the intellectual world of Paris pleased her as much as her success at balls. She was graceful, witty, vividly good-looking. Her hair was of unusual beauty, thick, glossy, and wavy. Fanny's pride in Florence was immense. Her hopes were brilliant. They were doomed. Florence's conscience was awake, and that in the brief halcyon period was over. It was 2 years since God had spoken to her. Why had he not spoken again? The answer was evident. She was not worthy. She had forgotten God in the pleasure of balls and operas, in the vanity of being admired. In March 1839, before she left Paris, She wrote in a private note that to make herself worthy to be God's servant, the first temptation to be overcome was the desire to shine in society. End of chapter 1.